Hi, everybody. Dan Brugman, one of the co-chairs of the Safety Council meeting, along with Christian here. We're here today to talk about some speed management practices within Milwaukee. And yeah, I guess just a couple housekeeping things at the beginning. We'll just have a 30-minute presentation or so with some questions, answers at the end. I will send out shortly after a link to the recording if you want to look at it again. Otherwise, the other thing too, we will also provide some PDHs for this, and I will send those out a week or so after, and you can kind of self-report those. I don't know if you have anything else you want to say, Christian?
No, nothing to add there. I can just introduce Kevin Muse, who will be speaking today. He's the city engineer for the city of Milwaukee, and he leads the infrastructure services division of the Milwaukee DPW. And he's responsible for the design, operation, and maintenance of city-owned streets, lighting, underground conduit, sewers, green infrastructure, bridges, and buildings. And at the direction of the Mayor Cavalier Johnson and the Milwaukee Common Council, he and his colleagues at the DPW, they're working aggressively to transform city streets to eliminate traffic fatalities and life-changing injuries by the year 2037, and redesign public right-of-way to provide high-quality public space for residents and serve all the users. Kevin is both a planner and an engineer and strongly believes that a robust multimodal transportation system is needed for the Milwaukee area to be economically competitive, resilient, and equitable. So with that, Kevin, I'll pass it off to you, and we're all looking forward to this presentation.
All right, thanks, Christian. I just kind of copy pasted my regular bio over there, and I didn't realize how exactly appropriate it would be for for this presentation today. But yeah, that's about as good as a launch as far as what we're trying to do at the city as I can picture. So thanks for having me today. Happy to be here. I do see, at least earlier, I saw both Joseph Blakeman and Kyle on from our traffic operations staff. Obviously, you two are also welcome to jump in and provide a little bit of color, extra commentary if you'd like, or we maybe answer questions together too if appropriate. But I will just share my screen here and take us through a presentation, and then definitely welcome questions. I think Christian, you said towards the end, but doesn't matter to me. So, all right, can everybody see my kind of full screen here, the presentation?
Yep.
Cool. All right, so as Christian just said, in the city of Milwaukee, we're struggling with a pretty aggressive transportation safety crisis. It has been challenging for a while in the city, and reckless driving has been a challenge for a while in the city. But as with many parts of the country and certainly many other larger urban areas, it seems like COVID and things around it just kind of supercharged some of those challenges. So we saw basically a doubling of our fatality rate, our annual fatality rate due to transportation each before and after COVID, basically. And it's only slightly going down. So we're trying to work as aggressively as possible. Do want to start off with acknowledging, obviously, infrastructure and engineering is only one part of that solution. I'm not going to talk today about the other things we're doing around enforcement and education and other elements of Vision Zero, but the city does kind of have a full attack that we're trying to do on this. My bio mentions the elected officials I work for on purpose. This is a very high level public-facing issue for the city, and it is certainly an element of a key to what the mayor sees for the future of the city is addressing this crisis. In fact, some polling was done not too long before the mayor's reelection campaign, which was in April of this year. And no surprise, the number one issue that was mentioned as of concern to residents was safety. And then among those who listed safety as their first concern, reckless driving was by far and away the number one safety issue that was listed of those residents polled in the city of Milwaukee. So the mayor's office sees this as a safety issue. They see it as a quality of life issue, and an economic development issue, and that's why we're focused on it. So what's up on screen is kind of just a general vision for the city streets. This is something that's not necessarily adopted by the council or anything like that, but it's consistent with the mayor's vision. And really that first one is what I focus on. Obviously, we're here to talk about safety and speed management and how those two things are interrelated. So I'll dig into that more. But really, for me, kind of the guiding principle is that far too many of our streets in the city don't productively add to the community around them. They actually harm property values. They harm residents' feeling of safety and quality of life, and they really should be an asset. And so that's kind of the guiding principle that I try to follow when we're making decisions about what the streets should look like in the future for the city. So streets must be safe for all users. And then finally, and this is not always something that is perfectly in alignment with all of our transportation engineering principles, but streets can also be a place first and foremost. It's public right of way. It's not necessarily a street first. And so that's another piece too. And I do have just a couple images of people having fun on the streets too. So with that, I will monkey around here until I can, there we go. Talk a little bit about our safety projects. So we kind of have three different contexts that we look at safety. And again, speed management is kind of the overall thrust of this presentation. I don't need to tell everybody here about the connection necessarily between speed and safety, especially in an urban environment where you've got a mix of users on the road. Obviously, those two things are highly correlated. We are doing more localized research on that, and I'll get into some of the data collection we're doing to make sure that that's still true. We know that to be true, but make sure that we're not just making a bad assumption there on that causation in addition to that correlation. But I want to talk a little bit first about how we kind of think about safety projects in the city. So there are generally three buckets. And these buckets have to do with the interrelationship between our speed management approach using infrastructure and our life cycle asset management from a pavement quality perspective that we also have to do in the city. So there's essentially three different contexts that we're going to do a safety project in. The first bullet is the one that I think probably everybody's very familiar with, which is the pavement has reached the end of its life or reached a point where it needs a major investment from a pavement quality perspective. We have plenty of streets in the city of Milwaukee that have reached this point and not enough resources to tackle it. But when we do get those resources, we really have started looking at, and this started before I joined the Department of Public Works. I've only been at the city since October of 2022, but it certainly is something that was already ongoing, but I feel like we've really kicked it into high gear over the last couple of years, that whenever we're doing a reconstruction or pavement replacement project, we're really viewing the street as a blank slate. So when the pavement reaches the end of life, it's time for it to be replaced. We're going to the residents with kind of saying, hey, what do you want this to be? And not starting with any sort of assumption that the curbs stay where they are, or that we're limited to even accommodating the current traffic volumes necessarily, or that the existing number of travel lanes or anything like that is automatically the place to default to. Of course, we end up back there with projects, but that's we really try to start with that kind of blank slate approach. The other two project types are generally don't include paving. They could include paving, but they don't have to. And it depends on the details of the project, whether or not they do. But the other two are either corridor retrofits, where we're looking usually at least a quarter mile, if not a mile or 2 miles long, set of investments to focus on traffic calming and speed management and slowing people down and reducing conflicts, and making any of those conflict points safer and slower. And then also spot improvements, which almost always doesn't include paving, and those are based on targeted hotspots. So how do we identify, especially for those last two? I think I made it obvious, but in case I haven't, for that first one, it's a mix of a safety concern and a pavement management concern when we're getting to a full reconstruction or pavement replacement. For the other two, it really is a safety-oriented thought process. We do have a project prioritization process that we're working on implementing within the department that looks at some socioeconomic characteristics, looks at use, so volumes on the roadway, and looks at safety, including crash data, among other things, to determine how we prioritize projects for these corridor retrofits or spot improvements. So in 2022, 2023, we did complete an update of our high injury networks in the city. It's actually plural, so that this slide I should have added an S on the end of network. But this shows a split map. North is on the left side, the south half of the city is on the right side of our high injury networks in the city. So any stretch that is highlighted in purple through our comprehensive crash analysis that was completed in 2022 is identified as a high injury corridor or section of roadway for at least one of the users, whether it's people walking, biking, or driving on that roadway. And then everything that's a circle is a intersection that is particularly bad. And so you can see that this is overwhelmingly concentrated. If you've got any familiarity with Milwaukee, or even if you don't, if you know what a grid city looks like, these high injury corridors are overwhelmingly concentrated on the minor arterials and major arterials in the city. That's where speeds are the highest generally. It's where there's the most conflict between people walking and driving in particular. These are also a lot of our transit corridors, so there are a lot of people out walking both to adjacent land uses, but also to and from bus stops. And so it does lead to a high incidence of crashes on a lot of these corridors. So we use this high injury network as one of the key things we're looking at when we're looking at where we should be programming improvements, safety improvements that are with an eye towards speed management. Again, as probably everybody who's listening knows, there's an interplay between county trunk highways, state trunk highways, state connecting highways, and local streets within the city of Milwaukee. We have all of those. We do have a disproportionate, with apologies to my friends at WISDOT, we do have a disproportionate number of or segments on our high injury network that are either state trunk highway or state connecting highway. Those are also some of the highest volume streets in the city, though. So in some ways that does make sense. And another piece for safety that does pose a challenge for the city across the north side of the city is that we're missing a portion of our regional freeway system on the north side. Not that I'm advocating that we go build it today, but back when we were building the freeway system in southeastern Wisconsin, the various options that were looked at to connect what's now I-41 to what's now I-43 were never built. And so we do have a number of east-west corridors, Capitol Drive, Hampton, Silver Spring, even Brown Deer and Good Hope in the city that are relatively high-speed roadways for an urban environment. And some of that is due to the fact that there isn't a decent non-surface arterial alternative for that traffic, where there is that alternative in other parts of the city. So get into some examples of what we're doing. So West Walnut Street reconstruction project. This was actually completed this past late spring, early summer 24, but the lion's share of the work was done in 2023. This project is a full reconstruction funded with federal surface transportation block grant dollars and local city of Milwaukee dollars. This project was all designed before I got here, so I'm not taking credit for this, but it's a great project that highlights a lot of the elements that we're looking to include in future projects. So just looking at some of these images, things to talk about. So on the top left there is a raised protected bike lane. Almost in one directional asphalt path, essentially, is what it is, raised up behind the curb at the same level of the sidewalk in the terrace, really providing, other than at intersections, maximum protection for people biking. The top right image is an overhead view, and it's a little hard to see, but if everybody here likely knows what all those pavement markings mean, but also you can sort of see it if you look at the image in the middle as well. We put in raised crosswalks and raised bike crossings at most of the intersections with the side streets on West Walnut Street. So this full reconstruction narrowed the roadway. We went from 2 driving lanes in each direction to 1 driving lane in each direction. Put in curb extensions. You can see in the middle picture where there's almost the opposite of a bump out, bump ins for parking as opposed to occasional curb extensions. They're pretty regular curb extensions, and then basically 1 driving lane in each direction plus a pretty substantial boulevard. The history of this stretch of the city, West Walnut Street, was put in by the city during urban renewal. So actually, the south frontage of the street used to be half the size before urban renewal, and the south frontage of the street was completely torn down to build that 4-lane boulevard. I don't want to get, I guess, too political about this, but I would say that on net has not been a positive for the city long term, and has made reckless driving very easy to do in this corridor. And so bringing in the curbs, putting in those raised crosswalks, raised bike lanes, is all in an effort to kind of counter what we enabled the last time we touched West Walnut Street. Actually, I'm going to shoot. I think I missed a slide here. Anyways, I had a nice before and after that I wanted to show you, but I think I missed it. That's fine. But yeah, so overall, reducing the amount of space going to cars and trucks, and adding space for pedestrians, bikes, that sort of thing. And that's the overall concept of what we're trying to achieve. Curb face to curb face, we went from stretches that were about 36 feet, I think, between the boulevard and the curb, to stretches that are as small as 14, 15, 16 feet in some locations. Probably not close to 14, but 15 or 16 feet in some locations in this corridor. Traffic volumes on the street were definitely low enough that this was a relatively easy thing to do from a traffic management perspective. East of this project, so the project that I just showed was a full reconstruction west of Interstate 43 in the city for 8 to 9 blocks, basically. East of the reconstruction, we wanted to continue those protected bikeway facilities, and also wanted to continue the traffic calming. So almost in coordination with that project, we did put in a retrofit project from I-43 to Valar Phillips Avenue, which is 4th Street. So 20th Street to 4th Street essentially was done almost at once. So this is an example of kind of more of a retrofit project. These are almost entirely what's shown in the image is concrete that was poured on top of the existing roadway. You can see we did do a mill and overlay in one section of the roadway where the pavement quality was particularly bad, but the rest didn't have any pavement treatments. And this is obviously mid-construction as well. You can see the pavement markings aren't done from this image on the left, but same thing. This shows a good example of what the street was. Again, that 34, 36 foot plus width, depending on where you are. And narrowing it down. So putting in the concrete islands, pouring those on top of the existing roadway. Bikes can go behind those concrete islands, and then it's the concrete island, the parking lane, a driving lane, and then as appropriate left turn lanes. So that's what we did with this project. We also, if people are familiar with the concept of a protected intersection, if not, go ahead and Google it. But we also kind of retrofitted a semi-protected intersection into this. So that's what the 8 islands you can see in that intersection in the top in the image on the left there represent. Basic concept there is to slow down turning movements as much as possible. So restrict those turning movements so that they're a little bit tighter for all users, and also, excuse me, provide in particular room for when someone's making a right turn. So from this image, if they're heading away from us towards the top of the image, which is eastbound, and they're turning to the right, which is southbound, there's enough space there where a typical passenger vehicle can actually wait for a pedestrian crossing or a bike crossing there at a better angle, so they can see the conflict of either the pedestrian or the bike coming, and wait there until it's clear to go. To again try to manage those conflicting movements and reduce the likelihood of a crash. Trying to think what else. Oh, so this is designed, again, it's pinned on top of the existing roadway. If it wasn't pinned on, we probably would have done some sort of mountable section versus full curb height sections so that we could manage different truck flows versus passenger vehicle flows with an eye towards safety. This is designed so that WB50s can make all maneuvers through the intersection. Excuse me. So and there are some facilities in the area that do take truck deliveries, and therefore that was important to make sure that we could maintain those movements through the intersection. I witnessed them myself. I'm always impressed with the skill of large truck drivers in the city of Milwaukee, and that is certainly true in this intersection too. I've stood out there on one of these islands actually, and watched a trucker do it very confidently and very successfully. Pull and then oversteer back to get into the lane. So did a great job. The image on the right shows another key of this project, which this intersection of Walnut and 6th Street shown here on the left is the intersection of two bus routes. The Route 80 is the bus on 6th Street, which is one of our more frequent bus routes in the city. So we did include some pavement removal and curb work to build bus boarding islands out into the intersection, both to use the bus as a pace vehicle for speeds on the street when it's on the street, and also prevent the need for the bus to merge all the way up against the curb and into the bike lane to pick people up and drop them off. So those are kind of the main purposes there. Also speeds up transit travel relative to people driving, which as a whole in the city, we would like to encourage and work with our partners at the county, which runs the transit system, to encourage more people to take transit around if they can. Couple other retrofit projects. I just wanted to show you kind of the span of things we're doing. The theme here is, use horizontal deflection or vertical deflection to try to manage speed, right? Which I think many of us are very familiar with these tools, but just wanted to show kind of the range. So the two previous slides, West Walnut Street to the west was a full reconstruction. To the east was probably our heaviest duty retrofit we've done. A lot of concrete added, not necessarily aesthetically pleasing, which is some of the feedback we've gotten. And so I also wanted to show other examples of road diets. Again, these are 4-lane to 2-lane road diets that use, maybe less intensive materials. So on the left here is Lappa Boulevard, which is a paint and post project that we did last year. So again, 2 driving lanes in each direction with a parking lane along the curb before the project. Afterwards, 1 driving lane in each direction, and then parking in what used to be the middle lane, and then a buffer, and then the protected bike lane. Again, this is just paint and delineator, plastic delineator posts. This one, we had some interesting challenges with neighborhood feedback, and we're actually working through some modifications to it to address some of the concerns we heard from the residents. Some of those were around the aesthetics, which I'm happy to answer questions about that if people are interested. But we did have great success in this corridor on our before and after speed data, and I'll share that in a little bit. The photo on the right is Highland Boulevard. Again, 2 lanes in each direction, 4-lane roadway with a striped bike lane and parking along the curb, switched to a parking protected bike lane. Again, to narrow up the street just due to excessive speeds, complaints of excessive speeds, and our own data collection showing that, and also crashes and other challenges in the area. One project here, I'm going to show you one more project that's a corridor retrofit, and what I want to highlight about this is whenever I do this presentation, I realize that we end up talking a lot about bikes, and although biking and making biking safer across the city is a very high priority of the mayor's and mine, especially these 2 projects are perfect examples of these are safety projects first, and the bike was more about, well, what do we do with the leftover space if we're not moving the curbs in? And so the bike lane is really there. I mean, obviously we want people to use it, but it's really there to take up the excess space that we wouldn't have anything else to do with if we didn't reallocate it to bikes in these areas. So Long term, we're building out that bikeway network over the next few years and beyond. But right now, both of these are isolated bike facilities. They're not part of larger corridors, and it's really more about the traffic calming and safety benefits and speed management benefits. So here's an example. The image on the left, unfortunately, I need to get back out there and take a better photo because that's an unfinished example. But I also wanted to show just how bare bones this stuff can get. So this is our Appleton Avenue retrofit project. This is a state connecting highway. So we did spend a lot of time talking with Southeast Region in the state of Wisconsin about getting this done. And they were great partners on this. Actually, Bob Gutierrez went to neighborhood meetings for this project, which I was very impressed with, and heard feedback. The Alameda neighborhood that this goes through has been asking for traffic calming for years and years and years. So we were very excited to be able to move this one forward. Again, paint and post. What's missing from the picture on the left that I need to go get a picture for, and what's shown in the plan set on the right is rubberized curb. So this was a 4-to-3 road diet. So going from 4 lanes to 3 with a twiddle in the middle. But at some key pedestrian crossings, as shown here at Chambers Street, we did include some rubberized curb segments in the middle there to provide better protection for that pedestrian crossing in a more temporary on-the-surface manner. And that rubberized curb is not yet installed in the picture on the left, and it is now, so I need to go get that photo. But the main idea here, so Appleton Avenue is one of our angled streets. It's not on the grid. Like much of the rest of the streets in the city. And so again, as any engineer will know, that's going to lead to a lot of awkward sight lines and bad sight lines, dangerous sight lines across the corridor. And then we were also seeing, again, a lot of excessive speeds. The image on the left isn't the greatest picture of the character of the corridor, but it is generally curb attached sidewalk with business frontages right up against that sidewalk. So there's not a lot of space. Cars were driving pretty fast on a 4-lane road, right up against, people with blind intersections because of where the buildings are, and lots of potential conflict points and lots of crashes. So this was to tee up those intersections, tee up as many of the movements as we could, and then obviously take a little bit of space away from cars to try to slow people down. One of our staff actually just went to a neighborhood walk in this area last night and got resounding positive feedback, more resounding than we're used to. And so the residents are really, really happy with this project. WISDOT is actually looking at a pavement project in this corridor for the future here in probably a few years from now, maybe several years from now. And we are very happy that this project is kind of a proof of concept that the state has already indicated that we're both parties are excited to partner on to implement as part of the state's paving project.
Okay, Kevin, one thing I was going to point out real quick on this one.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah, one of the big things we did with this, particularly with this Chambers intersection, I don't know if you mentioned it, we were able to shorten the crossings from like 80 feet down to 48. So we were able to significantly reduce that pedestrian crossing, which is a big reason for this particular corner here at Chambers being laid out this fashion, was to really shorten up those crossings. We got a lot of complaints over the years about those 80-foot crossings.
Yeah. Thanks, Joseph. Yeah, and obviously, I'm sure Joseph is well known by many people here for all of his very good work, and obviously has encyclopedic knowledge of all of this stuff. So I appreciate that. Thanks for adding that, because yes, those crossings are key, shortening it, reducing the exposure, slowing down the cars, and reducing the exposure to pedestrians. Or pedestrians, I should say. I did want to provide some examples of spot improvements too. Across the city, many of these end up being more on neighborhood streets, but not always, and they can take a lot of different forms. So you can see a very temporary traffic circle in the top left, which through a neighborhood traffic management program, we call it, but we're actually rebranding it to be something a little bit more obvious, but that resident-led traffic calming. We do have a program where people can request, and there's some amount of special assessment on their properties as part of that effort to put in speed humps and traffic circles and race crosswalks and speed tables and those sorts of things. So the top left is a temporary improvement that likely will get turned into a resident requested traffic circle in the future. In the middle, that's a speed hump. That's our bread and butter for neighborhood traffic calming, although we're trying to encourage maybe moving beyond the speed hump with our residents, and that's one of the reasons we're rebranding that program. But we've put in upwards of 1,000 speed humps since 2007 based on resident requests. On the bottom left and the bottom right, those are examples of spot improvements that are maybe on slightly more substantial streets, either minor arterials or collectors, and things that we can do. Again, as Joseph just correctly pointed out, shrinking the crossing distance for pedestrians, and then also on the bottom left in particular, a slightly raised crosswalk. This is in front of a school and connecting a school to a major county park. And so also providing some of that vertical deflection in addition to the horizontal restrictions. This is also a decent image on the right of what we call our pinned on concrete bump outs. I already kind of talked about these with several of the projects, but again, just to emphasize, these are pretty cheap. Depends on the context, but probably $5,000 to $8,000 each. So relatively inexpensive from an infrastructure cost perspective anyways. And they do allow us to shrink the crossings, reduce passing on the right, which is an unfortunately frequent occurrence in the city, and just generally trying to encourage people to be a bit slower in their driving maneuvers and more aware of what's going on. Those are, just wanted to highlight those because that is all poured right on the surface of the existing roadway. Depending on the length of it, certain amount of rebar put in just to pin it. That's the pinned on concrete part of it. Pin it to the roadway and then pour the concrete in forms directly on top of the roadway. So no excavation or anything like that involved in those. From an engineering perspective, achieves most of what we want to achieve from shrinking the crossing distance, shrinking the mouth at that conflict area, reducing, improving the angle of the turns, which you can see further out in the image there, and then also avoiding most of the potential utility conflicts and drainage conflicts that can really increase the cost of an installation. So we've been trying to copy paste those in as many places as makes sense across the city. So what does this look like? So we do collect, and actually we're expanding our collection of before and after data. So mostly this slide is all speed data. It says crash and speed data on the top, but we're not collecting crashes yet on these because most of these are too new for that. I'm not gonna read this slide off. My understanding is it will be, I'll send over my PowerPoint so it can be sent out afterwards. You can take a look if you'd like. But I did want to highlight one because I showed it. So the Highland Boulevard project between 35th and Bleat Street. Already described it to you, but 4 to 2 lane conversion, parking and pinned on concrete island protected bike lanes. I tend to look at the column all the way to the right as far as impacts, although all 3 of these columns are important. This is basically on this slide, most of this is 48-hour speed data collected before the project and then collected a minimum of 3 months after the project, sometimes much further than that. Generally collected at roughly the same time of the year so that we're trying to reduce the amount of noise in the data and making it as comparable as possible. So you can see on that Highland Boulevard project before and after, we reduced the number of vehicles that were, where drivers were driving more than 10 miles an hour over the speed limit or more, from 17% to 4%, so a 13-point drop. And you can kind of see the difference across all these different corridors. I may be overgeneralizing. I want to be careful here. I believe everything on this corridor, when these data were taken, was signed for 30 miles an hour. I think all these streets were signed for 30. So if you're looking at that median speed, that's what we're comparing against for the speed limit. Humboldt is now 25. Not sure if any of these other ones have moved to 25.
Yeah, these were all 30, and Humboldt's only been changed to 25.
Yep. Good thing Joseph's here. So we did, and this is definitely not a rigorous engineer's crash analysis, just to be clear. This is just kind of a quick grab of the data because it's too soon in many cases to do a real crash analysis. But we did want to take a look at a couple of these projects in a little bit more detail. So these are 2 projects, and really I just want to focus on Lapham Boulevard on the bottom there. That's the paint and post one that I spoke of. This one is the percent speeding and the median speed drop was about as aggressive as I've seen anywhere in the city. And so really the reason that I'm pointing this out is because we do get feedback from some within the city that the plastic post projects aren't effective and we should just only be doing concrete. We don't really have the fiscal resources to only be doing concrete. And so we did do before and after data on Lapham Boulevard, partially because it was all paint and post and we got some negative feedback on that. And it turns out that it was extremely successful. So successful that the residents accused us of making up the data, to which the alderman for the area correctly said at a public meeting, they wouldn't make up the data. They just wouldn't tell us they had it if it wasn't good. So we did not forge the data. So it was very effective at dropping the median speeds. Obviously, really on this crash data, it's way too soon to see if it's been effective. But it, nonetheless, we're hopeful that early returns are good, and we hope that that continues. Just wanted to point out, with those high injury networks, the type of things we're doing. So I try to avoid what some call counting widgets. So just, tallying up our output, how many things are we building? I really prefer to look at the outcomes, the speed data and the crash data as we can gather it. And we have enough time to look at the crash data appropriately. But I did just want to, highlight these two maps because it kind of shows the spread. On the left is the speed humps. That's almost entirely resident requested and resident led. And so you can see how widespread those are on residential streets across the city. Not all residential, but on side streets across the city. And then traffic circles are in blue, and those pinned on are actually bump outs of all kinds. So full reconstruction curb extensions, pinned on concrete bump outs, and paint and post bump outs are shown in orange on the right. And those tend to be more of our corridor treatments, which is why a lot of these are in a linear fashion on the right, the orange ones. I don't think I really need to go through this. I do want to leave enough time for questions. So I'm just going to skip through this, but if anybody's got questions about paving or funding sources, we can talk about that. And then I think I'll turn it over to questions now because the rest of this is just a few pretty pictures. So we don't need to show that. That can be part of sending it out later. So with that, Christian or Daniel?
Yeah, I think Joseph's been answering some questions in the chat, but if anyone
perfect.
has anything else to bring up, feel free to ask now.
I did skip over the snow plowing. I wanted Kevin to go ahead and answer that one. I know that comes up a lot.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've been working, so infrastructure, we design, operate, maintain the physical infrastructure. We do have an operations side of the house that does street sweeping, snow plowing, forestry, and sanitation, among other things. And so we do work closely with DPW operations on these projects. They have been very game and good partners for all the crazy stuff that we've been coming up with on the infrastructure side. So the way that we designed that retrofit on Walnut and 6th is that everything is at least an 8-foot minimum mouth, because that 8-foot minimum is from curb face to curb face for 8 feet clear, because that is what our pickup truck equipment uses as their blade. They've got an 8-foot V blade on the front. So we did very specifically design it so that the pickup truck can go through. So basically, the regular large salt truck or packer will do the driving lanes and make those turning maneuvers to get through and clear that. And then the pickup truck goes around in kind of a circle, or depending on how they're clearing everything else, a couple passes or a circle to do the cleanup. We did actually recently have a meeting with the specific staff who were clearing that intersection last winter, learned some useful things, but generally, again, they were game for the challenge, which is great, and I really appreciate it. How often are we remarking our pavement markings? Oh boy.
Yeah, I just pointed out, we're not repainting anything yet. We're still in pretty good shape with the first round of stuff we put in now 6-7 years ago. So I would anticipate, because nobody's really driving on these markings, we could easily get 10. or more.
That's what we're hoping for. Yeah. So if we do a mill and overlay, we're using thermoplastic usually. And that gives us a good amount of life. And then, yes, as Joseph said, we've got the epoxy markings as well that we use depending on the context. We do have a challenge maintaining what we already have in the city when it comes to pavement markings, so that we're aware of that. We know that's going to be a challenge. It'll be a challenge into the future. It's just a simple dollars and cents thing. Actually, some of these projects actually removed the amount of pavement markings because we're using concrete instead of striping to separate things. And so that actually, compared to some alternatives, actually removes a little bit of the striping maintenance. But yeah, it is a lot to keep up with.
Well, and I know you didn't touch
yeah.
on it, Kevin, but
Yeah.
just our 4 to 3 lane conversions that we were doing for the last 10 years. I mean, we've done probably 20 miles of those alone. And I know that you didn't really touch on that much in the presentation, but we have, pretty been aggressive in narrowing our streets, and taking those 4 lane undivided roadways down to 3.
Yep. Yeah,
We've
and that's a
done-
good point, Joseph. Yeah, it's a and you probably have the exact dates in your head, Joseph, but that's been several years now that we've been doing that effort, and it's been pretty successful. Again, we've got before and after data on that. We've been pretty happy with what the before and after data show on speeds and crashes. To us, those have become almost old hat, but I was actually reminded not that long ago that they aren't necessarily everywhere, and so that can be a great solution, and it's pretty low impact from an operations perspective. In many cases, we've seen, as many other cities have across the country, operations actually improves because you reduce the incentive to weave around left turning vehicles and that sort of thing. So
yeah, and then I should point out that those are eligible for HISP funding for anybody else that's listening. We did do a project with 8 locations and the 6-7 miles of roads, where we did do the 4 to 3 lane conversions. But like we've been doing a lot of those that are high impact projects citywide, and just trying to tackle as many of those as we can. It's kind of like level 1 before we go to PBLs. Protected bike lanes is like getting those roads down to a manageable level to reduce the high end speeds, as Kevin mentioned.
Yep. Yeah. I see William's got a question about fire and emergency responders. I mean, it's a delicate balance. I think there's kind of 2 thought processes. So one is, just like us in DPW, our fire department manages a very large fleet of heavy vehicles. So just like, this is something for us in DPW too. We don't love all the speed humps because of what it does to the vehicles, right? They take more wear and tear. Certainly their suspensions do on heavy vehicles. And so that is certainly something we're aware of, but obviously the alternative is not doing traffic calming, which isn't really acceptable to the residents or appropriate. When it comes to response times, we just try to be very careful about how we do it and have lots of active conversations with them. The police department's been a great partner. They know they don't have the staff or the manpower to be everywhere at once. So they like when our projects help reduce the need for traffic enforcement. And then fire department, again, it depends. They want to get their vehicles through. They want, every second is critical for a fire department for emergency medical services, and we respect that. But the flip side is they're also the ones responding to these terrible crashes. And so they do recognize that it's a balancing act of hopefully reducing the demand for their services, frankly, versus, adding a couple seconds to the response time. Yeah, and Joseph did answer that question around the assessments. It does. So we assess things that are what I would consider to be generally spot improvements. So we will assess a speed hump, a traffic circle, a pinned on bump out, concrete bump out, a speed table or raised crosswalk. Those are kind of all in our neck downs and chicanes. Those are kind of all in our wheelhouse. The key there is we're assessing those types of traffic calming improvements if the request for the improvement comes from the residents. And from a political perspective, it's kind of our hack around the high injury network issue, because if we're looking just at the public dollars we spend at DPW, we're going to prioritize projects based on that high injury network. but there are, resident concerns across the city, including on many streets that aren't on the high entry network. And so having this resident traffic calming program where part of the cost is assessed allows us to address those concerns without, necessarily playing some sort of favorites based on squeaky wheels with our DPW dollars. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but those are the sorts of things we can assess for.
And Kevin, I might want to touch on before we leave all the raised crossings and speed tables we're doing in front of schools over the next year or two.
Yeah,
dozens of locations.
Yep. So this is one of the things that the city did with some ARPA dollars that became available to it, the American Rescue Plan Act funds. And so we do have 20, we might get as high as 25, depends on how the construction dollars come in, locations across the city where we're trying to identify as best we can, put in a raised crosswalk at the primary pedestrian crossing for kids and families to get to that school. The specific primary crossing isn't always a great raised crosswalk candidate, depending on things everybody here knows, grading, utility conflicts, traffic flows, those types of things. But that's what we're trying to do. And we do have a priority matrix for how we're doing that, and looking across the city at raised crosswalks, and they've been pretty well received. And I will say, we're doing those on the very aggressive end of the ITE guidance. So and ITE just came out with some great guidance within the past couple of years on traffic calming, but some of the specifics in it around grades and slopes are very gentle compared to what we've been doing in the city of Milwaukee. And that is just based on resident feedback. If we followed ITE guidance for speed humps as an example, we would get feedback from residents saying those things don't work. So in fact, we get that feedback on ones that are more aggressive than the ITE. So we get more aggressive there. On raised crosswalks, we're within the ranges recommended by ITE, but on the aggressive end of all those ranges, because of just our experience here around what's effective, especially as larger and larger vehicles become normal on our roads. That vertical deflection needs to be higher to really encourage slower speeds with those larger vehicles. There's one more question in the chat. I know Christian or Dan cut me off if I shouldn't, but
no, you can touch on that one.
Okay. Yeah. So William, you asked if have you observed problems from aggressive drivers passing in center left turn sections in the twiddles? Yeah, that happens. So there's a thing locally that is kind of colloquially known as the Milwaukee slide, which means passing illegally on the right, usually in the bike lane, sometimes in the parking lane. And so we did put in a lot of those curb extensions to try to reduce the chances for people to do that passing on the right. We've seen an increase in passing on the left, not nearly at the rate that the passing on the right was occurring, but because of that, we've seen an increase in passing on the left. Countermeasures are median, concrete medians, that sort of thing. We're going to continue to watch that. I don't think we've got an obvious example or an obvious solution that works everywhere, because we see people passing the left into oncoming traffic over a double yellow. So there's some things that infrastructure would struggle to solve. I'll just put it that way. So some behavior is just difficult to manage with infrastructure. So yeah, overall a decrease on those areas. Certainly many fewer people passing on the left than were passing on the right, but some people are choosing to then pass on the left when they wouldn't have before. Mike, if only. So we do have some details. If anybody wants standard details for anything, feel free to reach out to me or contact me through Christian and Dan. That's fine. We are happy to share our standard design details for what we're doing. We do not have city guidance, mostly because of resources. We just haven't had the time or staff capacity, or the money to pay a consultant to develop an official guidance manual for the city. But we're slowly building those details over time as we go and modifying them. In fact, we just modified our traffic circle detail like 6 weeks ago, and it might be modified again within the next couple of weeks. So,
and I guess not to belabor, do we want to talk about the citywide speed limit study that we did, or is that ongoing, or is that wrapped up? I don't know where we are with that.
Yeah. No, that's a good point, Joseph. So we are, and obviously now the METCD has more flexibility in it, or the 11th edition does, although it's not obviously adopted in Wisconsin quite yet. But before that, even, we had undertaken an effort to look at other defensible ways to set speeds in the city. And so we are working our way through that, identifying priorities. Generally, what we'll probably be doing is dropping a bunch of streets down 5 miles an hour, basically taking our 30s, making them 25s, or 35s and making them 30. There is kind of a citywide conversation happening around going to 20 miles an hour on residential and side streets. Politically, that wasn't something that the Common Council immediately embraced. So I think we're kind of paused on that for now. And there would be additional signage requirements, I think, if we wanted to fully meet the expectations of state statutes, if we went to 20 miles an hour as the default speed citywide. So we're still working our way through that and haven't made that move yet. But yeah, we're in process. Not necessarily conclusions, but we will get conclusions soon on the commercial corridor speed limits.
Yeah, and I should point out for everybody in the audience, the city of Milwaukee, as far as I could tell when I researched it, is the only city that basically sets our default speed limit on our arterials to 30 by city ordinance. So if we want to actually go to 25, which is the state statutory speed limit, we actually have to legislate those down to 25 in the city of Milwaukee, the way our code is. And so just the simplest thing would be to undo that language. It would revert all of our arterial streets from 30 to 25.
Yep. 100%. Yeah.
All right, I think not hearing any more questions or seeing anything typed in. So yeah, really big thank you to you, Kevin. That was a great presentation and touched on a lot of stuff that you guys are doing in Milwaukee. And thanks, Joseph, for answering some of those questions in the chat too and chiming in when needed. So yeah, thank you. And just for the council as a whole, we'll probably have one more meeting this year, sometime in the fall, probably. So me and Dan will make sure to keep everyone posted on when we're planning that. And thanks everyone for joining.
I did go ahead and put my email in the chat, so feel free to reach out if you've got any other requests or questions that you think of. So.